John Powell, the 2008 recipient of the Abraham Krasnoff Courage and Commitment Award. Hear ye him.
Thank you. That was a very kind and loving presentation. And if you didn't already know, you know now more about Lynetta Gilbert and her work, not just at the Ford Foundation, but throughout the country. So before I share with you my remarks, join me again in recognizing Lynetta Gilbert. So it really is an honor to be here among so many really wonderful people, friends, old friends and new friends. Someone asked me how I got here, and I said, you know, I got a call from Elaine. They said, and that's all it takes to get me here, because I deeply respect the work that Elaine is doing, and also I respect her friendship. I've been doing this work, whatever this work is, a long time. I'm one of those people who sometimes says, how did you pick what you want to do? And in some ways, I feel like it picked me when I was 11 years old. And I've been trying to do that work ever since. Now, all of us, I think if we reflect on how we got to where we are, we tell stories about our families. So I'm going to say a little bit about my family and then a little bit about the work. For those of you who are Star Trek fans, I'm 6 of 9. My families were sharecroppers in the South and moved to Detroit like a lot of people who move throughout this country and throughout the world. People move for opportunity. People move because they want to make a better life for themselves, their families, and those around them. So my family went to Detroit. And my father worked very hard. My mother worked very hard. And I've had friends who talked about, you know how it is when you grow up in a family and there's all this family strife and, people don't like each other. And I have to quietly say, I don't really. Because my family was a family of deep, profound love. And it still is. In fact, I'm the only one of 9 children that left the Detroit area. And it really created a hole in the family that I didn't understand and appreciate until I was much older. It's like, well, you got 8 other kids there, But now I do understand. And one of the reasons I'm in Columbus is because I want to be close to my dad and my family. They're 2.5, 3 hours away, and I can run up and run down on the same day. But it's not just coming from a loving family that helped me get grounded in this work. It's also seeing what was happening in the country in terms of disrespecting and ignoring the talents and the energy and the love of this wonderful family. I remember when I was a young boy and my father was working on a furnace, and the furnace blew up and burned all the hair off of his body. And we're driving around Detroit to try to find a hospital that will accept an African-American man. And I remember when my father had another accident and literally lost the vision in his eyes. And again, trying to find a hospital that would accept an African-American man. I have many incidents like that in my life, but it seemed to me that something so fundamentally wrong could not be left standing. I had a lot of opportunities. I got to go to wonderful colleges and meet wonderful people, but even in college, I faced things that just seemed fundamentally wrong. I went to Stanford, and let me just tell you how I got to Stanford. I took a train. But why Stanford? I graduated in 1965, and I was one of the, I always loved knowledge. I always loved information. I always loved learning. And so I came at a time where the country was starting to wake up and realizing that there was some contribution that African Americans have made to this country. So I was recruited by a number of schools, Princeton, Harvard, Michigan. And I thought about going to Harvard, My parents were very proud that I'd gotten into Harvard. And at the time, Harvard didn't allow women into Harvard. And people said, but that's Radcliffe. I said, but that's not Harvard. And I said, I cannot go to a school that will not allow women as full citizens. I didn't say it just like that. I was 17 years old. Give me a break. But that's what I meant. And the resistance and rancor, people said, you're turning down Harvard? And Stanford at the time allowed women in. At the time, it was 2 men to every woman, except for African Americans, which was 1 to 1, which was a very subtle but serious message. So I ended up at Stanford. And at Stanford, I remember taking a test. It was actually a math test. And I got a score on the test, and I didn't know what the score was. I knew what the score was, I didn't know what the grade meant. I think it was 88. And I got a B on the test. And someone later told me, you got 88 and a B? I said, yeah. They said, you got the highest grade on that test. And I went in to talk to the teacher, and I said, someone said this was a curve and I'd gotten the highest grade on the test. And he said, yes, but there's no way you could have gotten that grade. You must have cheated. The only grade I will give you is a B. So I had a lot of those experiences, but many of them, most of them, were experiences with people, experience of people trying to really do what's right to make a life for those around them, and constantly being frustrated by sometimes people, but sometimes structures and institutions. So let me fast forward and talk a little bit about where we are today. I've had the pleasure of meeting and knowing the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, Senator Barack Obama. I had the privilege and honor of going to Yale Law School with President Bill Clinton. And the reason I mention that is that I think the country is in a particularly interesting, this mic is a little short and I'm a little tall, I've had the pleasure and opportunity to know really wonderful people. And we're at a particularly interesting time. We're at a time where we might have a president of the United States that is African American descent in the next election. And yet, when we look around at our schools, we look around at our prisons, we look around at our housing patterns, we look around at wealth in this country, there's still this deep underbelly of racial inequality in this country. We're at an incredible crossroads. We're at a crossroads where we are about to maybe make history that will reverberate around the world. And at the same time, we're incarcerating more people of color and more people, period, than any country on the planet. How can both of those things be true? How can it be that America has grown to the point where equality has some meaning to it, and yet in our day-to-day lives, we still live in very segregated places where opportunity is distributed racially? That's the challenge. That's the challenge of erase racism. That's the challenge that Elaine and all of you are trying to grapple with. And it's a challenge on multiple fronts. One front is just, how do you communicate it? How do you communicate to people when they say, you know, whether they're white, black, Latino, Asian, American Indian, that they love Oprah and mean it, and yet still live in racially segregated communities? And segregated communities are not just communities where people are separated by race. It's where we distribute opportunity through a racialized lens. So that's the complication that we have to deal with. How do we understand that? And this is how I understand it. We have trouble understanding the racial template of our society today because we grew up understanding race where the poster boy of racism was Bull Connor, where someone would stand up and explicitly in your face say, segregation forever, where someone would say they did not want to be around black people or Latinos or Native Americans or Jews, where they weren't subtle about their racism. So racism, as we understood it as a country, was about personal animus that was expressed deliberately, violently, and vocally, time and time again. So when something happens where there's tremendous racial inequality, we look for Bull Connor. And if we can't find Bull Connor, then there are pundits who tell us it must be, if blacks aren't doing well, it must be their fault. If Latinos aren't doing well, it must be their fault. Because we passed Brown v. Board of Education, we passed a fair housing law, we passed laws that created space for people to actually move and work and live together. And if they're not moving, working, and living together, it must be because they don't want to, or it's their fault. And this is not a talk against personal responsibility, because personal responsibility is real. But our personal responsibility and personal choice sits upon structures and institutions that constrain, define, and affect those choices. And that's the piece of the equation that's missing. So coming up here today from Columbus, I'm reading the New York Times, and it says, there's an article in there that's very interesting. It says, there's a housing crisis. And in this crisis, renters, homeowners, bankers, and security workers are bound together in a chain. And when one of them falls, all of them fall. What they're talking about is a structure that distributes or retards opportunity in our society. And without understanding how this structure operates, we don't understand racism in the 21st century. Racism of the 1950s is largely, not entirely, but largely dead. The mechanisms, the lever of racism today are actually implemented, engaged, and reproduced through our institutions. So let me give you just a couple of quick examples and then I'll end. And let me start with something that's a little less, maybe, incendiary than talking about racism in America. Let's go back to the 1930s and think about Social Security. Social Security has been described as the most universal program in our country that changed the lives of millions of America and created this robust middle class that we enjoy today. Well, let's think about it just for a moment. There were some parts of Social Security that were particularly interesting. One was, if you work, you can get unemployment insurance. If you work, you can get Social Security. The catch was, what counts as work? And there were 3 or 4 things that did not count as work. One of them was domestic work. Another was farm work. Another was working in the home. Now let's just unpack that for a minute. Domestic work and farm work knocked out 80% of the African Americans living in the South. They were not included in this otherwise what looked like universal program. Women did not work in the formal workplace, they worked in the home. Their work did not count. So this program, this system that was not necessarily pernicious, it did not require Bull Connor, it defined a set of relationships that meant that women, blacks, and Latinos did not participate in the Social Security program of our country. Those systems are still in place today. And the remnants of those systems are still in place today. Well, you may say, well, that was a long time ago. What about today? Well, let's talk about today. The federal government has a program called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, which is the largest program in the country for building affordable housing. And in this program, it says it prefers to have housing built in distressed areas. What is a distressed area? A distressed area is where there are no jobs, where there's no tax base, where the schools are not working well. We used to call it a ghetto. So the federal government, not 50 years ago, not 20 years ago, is taking your money and building affordable housing for low-income families in ghettos across the United States. Then it turns around and says, if your child goes to a school that's not performing, we would like to help you get out. Well, what's a school that's not performing? Virtually every school that's not performing is a school that's racially and economically segregated. So now, complete the circle. So we are building housing today for low-income families of color and whites, but largely low-income families of colors in ghettos where they will go to highly racially segregated and economically segregated schools. And those schools, by and large, will fail. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Art Eisenberg. He was talking about the prison to pipeline. One of the greatest predictions as to whether or not an African-American kid will go to prison or not is whether or not they go to a segregated schools. Very high correlation. Now, I'm not saying that anyone administering that program is Bull Connor, is George Wallace. I'm not saying that there's any racial perniciousness in this activity, but the outcome is predictable. This is structural racism. This is using our institutions to create racialized opportunities that, if we stop for a minute, are completely predictable. So why is it so hard for us to see this? And one reason is our own comfort zone and the stories we tell ourselves, but the other is the time delay. We do something today, 10 years later, 12 years later, kids go to prison. We don't see the connection. There's a time delay. And we have trouble seeing things that are in relationship to each other and that are time delayed. And the best example I get of our inability to see things that are time delayed is childbirth. Now, we have been on this planet as people for about 2 million years. For the first 2 million of those 2 million years, we didn't realize what caused pregnancy. We only figured that out about 7,000 years ago. It's not very long out of 2 million years. Why did it take us so long to figure out sex had some relationship to pregnancy? Because there was a time delay. It's like I did something 9 months ago and then a baby pops out. That's no relationship. And I did it with this woman, nothing happened. I did it with that woman, something happened. There's no causal relationship. So for literally 2 million, about 2 million years, we had no idea of where babies came from. In fact, the current wisdom 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and it wasn't entirely wrong, is that women were magic. They just, So I'll end just by saying this. I think we're at an incredible time, but it's also a dangerous time. Because, this is not a political campaign, but I do hope the country makes history. But even if it makes history, in some ways, especially if it makes history, it will be harder for us to understand how these structures continue to operate that will continue to truncate the lives, not just of blacks and Latinos and Asians and Native Americans, but of the country. Because as we move to a country where whites are no longer in a majority, if we don't use all of our resources, and the only way we can use our resources wisely is to make sure our institutions are structured to actually serve the values that we say we have. And so I think our challenge is to make our institution work not just for the elite, not just for those who had a chance to go to Harvard or Stanford or Yale, but to make them work for everyone. And to do this means that we have to understand and embrace a structural analysis. And I'll end by just saying thank you again to Erase Racism. Thank you to Al and John and Joan and all of you, not for this award for me, but for the work you do every day to make this country real. And as Senator Obama said, to make this a more perfect union. Thank you.
And this is the Abraham Krasnoff Courage and Commitment Award for John Powell. It's just a little token from us. Thank you.